so with that, we are going to get started. We'll first start with a welcome. My name is Caitlin Majika, and I work with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I'm a former special education classroom teacher at the middle and elementary school levels. And I'm really excited today to share a little bit more about behavior progress monitoring, supporting students with behavior challenges in the classroom setting. Behavior interventions, behavioral assessment is where my background is, where my passion is. And so I'm very excited to share that with you all today. So I want to know a little bit more about you, and I appreciate you obliging. I'm sure you've done this in all the other sessions, but I want to know a little bit more about you. So in the chat, if you could let me know kind of where you're calling in from, the role you are, and then we have a little rating scale here to share with me your familiarity and your comfort with progress monitoring. So if you can go ahead and put that in the chat. Thanks, Kristen. Calling in from Michigan, a TA provider, somewhat familiar or comfortable. Great. We've got some North Carolina, another 2, Ohio. Great. Louisiana, parent. Awesome. Welcome. We've got some 2s and 3s on the rating scale. Great. Oh, from California. We span from coast to coast here. Great. Great, a 0. We welcome everyone from 0 to 5. So if you're going to learn more, you're going to build your fluency. We're happy to have you. Thank you. We've got Michelle, North Dakota. Awesome. Rated yourself a 4. Awesome. Philadelphia. We've got some Montana right in the middle. Awesome. Delaware, Texas. Great. Another Louisiana Resource Center. Great. Well, welcome everyone. I am calling in from Nashville, Tennessee, where I just moved, but I grew up on the East Coast, so very familiar with a lot of these areas. So welcome. So we are going to talk today, do a deep dive in behavior progress monitoring. We're going to start with a case study to set the stage. I really like to ground my presentations in an example that we can use to apply some of the knowledge that we're learning. We'll do a very brief overview of progress monitoring in general, go over the steps of behavior progress monitoring, conclude with some information about making instructional decisions using progress monitoring data, and then we will share some additional resources if you want to learn more. There's a lot to behavior progress monitoring, so we're going to give you an overview of the entire process, but know that we're going to share those resources so that you can go learn more if you need to. So let's start by setting the stage here. We're going to start with a case study with a student named Eduardo. And we're going to use this throughout so that we can apply every step of the behavior progress monitoring process. So I'm going to read this out loud. Eduardo is a 6th grade student in Mr. Kim's math class. Mr. Kim has been struggling with Eduardo during class for the past month. Eduardo is constantly off task, requires a lot of redirection to tasks, especially during independent work time on his laptop. Mr. Kim is also concerned that Eduardo's time off task is impacting his progress in math. And recently, Mr. Kim met with his fellow 6th grade teachers for a data team meeting. During this meeting, Eduardo's screening data show he is at risk in math and in academic behavior. Okay, so I just want to stop and think for a moment, kind of map this onto your own experience, regardless of the level you are, kind of thinking about students like Eduardo who might need more support in the classroom, in academics and behavior, or perhaps just behavior. Okay. So after that data team meeting where the teachers were reviewing the screening data, they decided Eduardo is going to begin a math intervention with Ms. Jones, who's the interventionist, twice a week during Tiger Time. Also, Eduardo is going to start a behavior intervention. He'll do the check-in, check-out program. And Mr. Kim and that math interventionist are going to work together to create a progress monitoring plan for Eduardo that they can use to monitor academic behaviors in the intervention, but also to think about those other behaviors that we're working on during intervention time. So let's dive into it. We're going to start with an overview of progress monitoring in general, kind of regardless of the domain. And really here, it's repeated measurement of student performance over the course of an intervention. And we do this to index or quantify the responsiveness to that intervention. The key here is that it's repeated measurement of the student's performance over time, so you can really measure growth and change. Progress monitoring is important as it allows teachers to figure out and analyze on a regular basis when you need to make changes to those interventions. So if a student is responding, when do we need to start fading that support? And if a student is not responding or we're seeing continued challenges, what do we need to do to change the program so that we are seeing that success in the students? So we also like to share a little bit about the difference between monitoring progress and this more formal term progress monitoring that we're going to be talking about today. So they are not the same and not interchangeable, even though they use both of the same words. So let's start with monitoring progress. And I want you to think of this as what good teachers in classrooms do. This means we're collecting often informal, perhaps unstandardized data. These are data we collect during daily instruction, and teachers are using those data, that information, to make real-time instructional decisions. So think of things like asking questions, using formative assessments, the bell ringer, those exit tickets, providing feedback to students, okay? This is what's used in classrooms. It's used for all students over the course of a teacher's instructional period, okay? Progress monitoring, on the other hand, what we're going to learn more about today is a more formal process. Here we're using valid and reliable measures, and they have a standardized delivery, which means everyone who administers does it in the same way. The frequency of which we use progress monitoring depends on the intensity or level of the instruction that we're providing. So thinking about the differences between maybe students who receive tier 2 or tier 3 services, and often to the recommendations of the developer or how the tool is intended to be used, something like, are we using this weekly or monthly? In addition, this formal progress monitoring process requires ongoing and graphed data, and we need enough data, so 6 to 9 data points, to make sure that we have enough for a valid interpretation. Also, this more formal progress monitoring process, the reason it's so important that we're using those valid, reliable measures in a standardized way is that we're making important decisions. So oftentimes these decisions are related to perhaps a special education referral, perhaps if a student is meeting IEP goals and we need to make changes or adjustments to the IEP. And also we have students who need intensive intervention or receiving targeted intervention, and we need to determine if that student is making sufficient progress to stay or transition to a different type of intervention. So we make really important decisions using progress monitoring data. And so therefore the process is a bit more formal, and we need to really think about the measures that we're using. So now that we understand kind of the difference between monitoring progress, what good teachers are doing, and this more formal process, I really want us to ground us in why progress monitoring is so important, why it's important that we understand, okay? First of all, we really want to know those students who perhaps are not making adequate progress. We don't want students to just continue receiving an intervention and not show growth, especially for students who have the most intensive needs. We know that time matters, and we need to start interventions that are effective as soon as possible so that they can make adequate growth. So these progress monitoring data are allowing us to know which students are not making adequate progress and allowing us to make those instructional decisions to determine how we can change the program to better meet the student's need. These data are also helping support communication among staff, so staff to staff, staff to administrators, but also communication with parents and the students themselves. You can show in an objective manner how a student is doing, how a student is progressing, or if they're not progressing, to show the changes that you've made and how the student is progressing through the program. For students who are receiving special education services, okay, this helps develop and write an IEP. It's going to help you develop and write those present levels of performance. It's going to help inform those IEP goals, and it's going to help you monitor that plan or those goals for students with disabilities. It helps us estimate rates of improvement over time with your student. So again, it's repeated measurement over time. So it's going to help us estimate those rates of improvement, help us make predictions for where we expect a student to be. And it also helps compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction. So when we're collecting data, if we make a change, we can immediately and directly see if that change is beneficial to the student or if that change is showing no or maybe growth in the opposite direction. So it really helps us figure out what program is going to be the most effective for a student. And here at NCII, the National Center on Intensive Intervention, we ground everything in the data-based individualization process, or the DBI process. And here's the graphic showing this, the entire process from start to finish. And as you can see here, progress monitoring comes into play at 2 key time points within the DBI process. So here, and again, you can see that we're using this progress monitoring data to determine if a student is responsive or non-responsive. And regardless of which way, that helps us make key decisions about a student's performance and how we are going to continue providing interventions for those students. Okay. So that was an overview kind of generally about progress monitoring, the importance of it in general. And now we're going to think about behavior progress monitoring. So we have a student who has a need in a behavior, social, emotional, behavioral wellness area, and we are going to implement an intervention, and we want to know if that intervention is effective. So how are we going to do that? Here are the 5 steps we're going to go through today about progress monitoring for behavior. First, we're going to select and define that target behavior. So what is the behavior we're going to try and improve and target with the intervention? And we hope that the data will show are improving. Then we are going to select and align a progress monitoring tool. We are going to create a progress monitoring plan to ensure that we've mapped out all of the details. We are going to set goals and decision rules for the student so that we as teachers and teams know when a student has met the goal. And then we're going to collect, graph, and analyze continued progress monitoring data. Okay. So let's dive in. What we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the steps. I will define them, give you a few examples, and then we're going to revisit Eduardo, Mr. Kim, to see how we can map on each step to a student example. So the first step is to select and define a target behavior. Okay. So this process starts by listing behaviors that are identified as problematic by the student's teacher and from screening data. Okay. So Mr. Kim had concerns in the classroom. All of those behaviors or his concerns should be listed. And then we also want to add in anything that was identified from behavior screening data that's showing an area of at risk. So we know from the case study that that was academic behaviors. That was one area where Eduardo was at risk. Okay. Once you have that list, you are going to prioritize the most salient, the most important behavior, or the one that's going to really set the student up for success, because we don't want to bite off more than we can chew. We really want to focus in. Okay. And once you identify that behavior of focus, so what is the student needing more support in, having challenge with, we are going to identify a replacement behavior. Okay. Now, replacement behavior just means what is the behavior you want the student to engage in instead of the problem behavior. Okay. So this is the behavior you want to improve. So we start by thinking about where the challenges are, and then we're going to reframe those to, okay, if the student's having challenge with this behavior, what do we want the student to do with instead? What is the more expected appropriate behavior that we are going to target with our intervention and we're going to hope to improve? Okay. So for example, if a student has trouble with shouting out, a replacement behavior would be raising your hand to get attention instead of shouting out to get attention from a peer or a teacher. So once we've selected that target behavior, again, this is that replacement behavior, what we're hoping to improve, we need to create a definition of that. And why this is important is that for each student, even if you have the same general domain of behavior, so something like shouting out or off-task behavior or on-task behavior, that might look different for each student or manifest different. So what's really important in behavior progress monitoring is that we start by clearly defining that target behavior so that we know what the intervention is focused on and what we are measuring with our progress monitoring tool. When we define the behavior, we want to use clear, concise language. We want to make sure that when we create this definition, it can be observed and measured by others. So we're making it as objective as possible. And we want to include examples and non-examples. And I find for me that the definition is one thing, but these examples and non-examples are really what makes it observable and measurable. So let's look at some examples of target behaviors. And we're going to start from poor and go all the way to best and with a little bit of a rationale. So if we were just to say Tara is not disruptive in class, this is our target behavior we want to improve. It's not really measurable, observable. It leaves room for subjectivity. And we're kind of using a negative here of what we don't want Tara to do. Okay. So instead, what's better, Tara makes appropriate comments during class. Okay. We're adding more context here, but we don't really have enough detail of what that looks like and what kind of an appropriate comment to you might be different for me. And so what's best here is something like Tara uses respectful language when speaking with teachers and peers, talks about related tasks during their work group, and provides on-topic response when asked a question. So this specifies kind of what appropriate language looks like in the classroom, and it gives us a little bit more information than the other two examples. So let's go back to Eduardo. And here I'm going to walk you through an example of defining this step one, kind of identifying and defining that target behavior. So we know from the case study that was matched with the screening data, Mr. Kim has noted off-task behavior as a struggle. The screening data noted that academic behavior, like off-task behavior or engagement, is also a challenge for Eduardo. So this is a behavior that they focused on. And we're going to identify the target behavior, which again is a replacement behavior. What we want Eduardo to do instead is on-task behavior. Okay, this is the behavior we're going to hope improve by the intervention and what we're going to be monitoring. So take a moment and read over the definition and examples. So here we see that Mr. Kim has defined on-task behavior as appropriately participating in classwork and completing assignments as expected. And then if you notice, the examples and non-examples really make this observable and measurable by giving specific instances. So that appropriately participating means we're using materials appropriately. Eduardo is completing work as expected. He's participating in the lesson. He's participating in small group work, interacting with the correct website when on his laptop, and he raises his hand to ask for help when needed. And those non-examples, again, are kind of the opposites of those examples of what it looks like when Eduardo is not on task. This is when he is not engaging in our target behavior. Okay, so we're going to take a moment now for some interaction in the chat. And after that first step, we talk about target behavior. I want you in the chat to know what are some common target behaviors or student behaviors that you find you are currently progress monitoring for, or that you're in need of progress monitoring for. Go ahead and put those in the chat. Okay. Oh, yes, we see blurting out. Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. We want to ask for help appropriately, which often means in many contexts raising our hand. Oh, yes, those transition times can be challenging, that we want to make sure that the student is able to transition appropriately, getting ready to go home. Also, keeping hands to ourselves. Absolutely. Aggression. Absolutely. Oh, eloping. Yes. Eloping, work avoidance. And you see here, we have a wide range of behaviors, including some that don't pose necessarily a safety risk, all the way up to eloping or self-injurious behavior that are a high risk of injuring self or others. And so as you're going through this and we're working through the examples, kind of take note as to kind of what applies to each situation. Great, starting and staying on assignment. Social interaction, absolutely. Inappropriate interaction with peers, great. Yes, we want to make sure that we're interacting with peers, and we're doing so appropriately or positively. Hands-on behavior, absolutely. Okay, so as we're going through, when you think about how these steps map on to the students that you have seen, or you work with directly, or you work with staff who works with these students, and how that works. Appropriate, use of materials, that's right, yes. I'm laughing because in middle school, I feel like kids are very creative with how they use their materials. I learned as a teacher. So great. So now that we were kind of thinking, we got you primed thinking about those target behaviors. And again, as we're thinking about target behaviors, we want to also think about those replacement behaviors. What do we want the student to engage in instead? The next step is to select and align a tool. Okay. So we want to think about selecting a tool that is going to capture the target behavior in a meaningful way. So we're going to go through some examples today of observation or direct behavior rating. We also want a tool that can be feasibly incorporated into the teaching routine. Okay. We are not expecting teachers to have to stop collect progress monitoring data and ignore all that's going on in the classroom. We need to find a tool that a teacher can use as part of the teaching practice that can be embedded into the school as part of the teaching practice. We also need something that has an appropriate scale for measurement. So really each of the behaviors, depending on the intensity, the duration, we need to measure them in different ways. We need to make sure the tool is able to do that. And once we select a tool, we then need to do a little bit of work to align the tool with the target behavior. Okay, so we're going to customize it a bit in a way that's going to match that definition. So where can you find progress monitoring tools? NCII has a resource, the Behavior Progress Monitoring Tools Chart, that lists a variety of behavior progress monitoring assessment tools, and it gives a rating on their technical adequacy. So if you are in the market to learn more about a tool or to figure out if the tools you currently have available at your school are adequate or sufficient for their purposes being used, you can use this tools chart to help you figure that out. We also are going to walk through a couple examples today, direct observation and what's on the right side of your screen, direct behavior ratings that come from work at University of Connecticut that are freely available, highly customizable, and can be implemented and used in your schools relatively quickly. Okay. So again, as I mentioned, these are two common tools for progress monitoring of behavior. On the left-hand side, we have systematic direct observation, and we have direct behavior rating, or DBR. And I'm going to go through what each of them is, an example, and then we're going to talk through advantages and challenges. No tool is going to be perfect for every situation, every behavior. And so as you're thinking about the tool, really wanting to think through what is going to work for me. So systematic direct observation simply is observing a student and systematically observing, recording behavior as it's happening. An example could be tallying the number of times a student raises their hand to respond during a whole group lesson. What's advantageous about direct observation, it is highly aligned to the behavior being observed because you are observing the behavior that you've selected. It is applicable to a wide variety of observable behaviors. Pretty much if the behavior is observable and measurable, you can use this method. And what's great is you can measure various dimensions of a behavior. So we can count the frequency of something. We can time the duration, how long something lasts. You can capture the latency. So if you give a direction, how long does it take a student to start the task? You can also measure intensity of a behavior. I think I mentioned total duration, interval recording. There's lots of different ways you can record behaviors for this, which makes it very useful. Now, with those advantages are also some challenges that don't mean to detract from the tool, saying you shouldn't use this, but this is something to keep in mind. Often we see that this type of direct observation is used for more students with intensive needs, and when you have staff available who have the time to more directly observe, because it is hard to do this while teaching. So this one is more time intensive, right? It does require a trained observer. So the person who's collecting data does need to be able to trained in the definition of the target behavior, trained in the measurement system. So if you're recording count or duration, or you're using any types of stopwatches, that person needs to be trained. And this is often best done by an observer who can take data while somebody else is doing the instructional time. It can be pretty challenging to do this while you're also teaching other students. On the other hand, we have direct behavior rating, which is still, we're observing a student's behavior, but we are doing a brief rating of that target behavior after a specific observation period. Okay, so for example, you're just going to mark off on a scale of 1 to 100%, how often was a student engaged during this one part of the lesson. The advantages of a direct behavior rating is that we're instrumentalizing, we're proceduralizing, we're standardizing kind of a traditional rating systems. And we're doing this in a way that we could use those ratings as outcomes that we could measure over time and have repeated measurements. This allows you to feasibly collect data multiple times. So this could be used across multiple students or multiple behaviors while the teacher is still able to perform all of their other duties. And there is some evidence behind it that it's valid, reliable, and feasible. Okay, so it really does kind of, the direct observation is a pretty intense way of measuring behavior, but there are some situations and behaviors and students who require that level. But for many, if we don't quite need that level, a direct behavior rating is going to be great and give you that snapshot in time. Okay, A downside of a direct behavior rating, it's not really providing granular level of data needed, that for some students, we might not be able to see those changes over time. So again, there's no such thing as a perfect tool. And we're going to give you an example. I'm going to show you what a direct behavior rating is. And it really is pretty easy to implement if that's where you wanted to start. Okay. So again, in the chat, have you ever used either of these methods for progress monitoring before or collecting data? And if not, what tools have you used? And Amy has provided the links in the chat for what some of those resources we shared. So thank you, Amy. All right, we've got someone who's used direct observation or someone who's used both. Great. We've got 2 thumbs up. Awesome. Oh, and some people who have used both. This is great. And hopefully for those who've used both, and feel free to add this in the chat, once you use both, you can, I feel like you can feel kind of the advantages or challenges of both of them and start differentiating between what types of behaviors or what situations with students really require the more intensive approach of direct observation versus something like a daily behavior rating. So this is great. I'm glad we have some experience here. So for those who may have not used it, or just as a reminder, because this can look differently, and again, we've adapted this all from those freely available information on the University of Connecticut's website, as an example of a DBR rating scale. Okay, so this is a blank one that has not been aligned yet. It has a spot for the student name, the target behavior, the definition of behavior, and then we see this rating scale ranging from 0%, which is never, all the way over to 100%, which is always. Okay. And here with the target behavior and the definition, this is where you can align the DBR to match that target behavior and definition for individual students. So if you're using a DBR across multiple students or multiple behaviors, that is great, but we're making sure that each one is aligned to the student. So let's go back to the case study. Mr. Kim has selected the DBR to match percentage of engagement in on-task behavior as a place to start. He chose this because he was concerned about being able to teach and collect data at the same time, but a DBR allows him to conduct the rating one time and provide kind of that overall snapshot of Eduardo's behavior. He also chose this because Eduardo, remember, he's receiving that math intervention and he's also receiving check-in, check-out. That's also targeting on-task behavior. And so we're really there's high alignment between that intervention and this on-task behavior that we are progress monitoring. And the DBR has a rating scale that measures the percentage of time on task. And this is exactly what we're interested in improving, increasing his percentage of time on task during math. So the DBR is very well suited for what Mr. Kim needs and for thinking about Eduardo's behavior. So here's an example of what an aligned DBR rating scale looks like that's complete. So it has his name, the target behavior, and then we've just copy and pasted the definition of on-task behavior with the examples and non-examples. Okay. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit here and note that the step of defining a target behavior is so important because we are going to be observing and rating that behavior every single time. And there's something called observer drift, where over time, our definition or expectation or understanding of a behavior starts to morph and shift and change. And if we're changing too much, all of a sudden, we're not measuring on-task behavior in the same way. Again, this is different than math or reading when the student is given the same assessment, asked to complete the same type of math facts or read the same type of words with a similar pattern. We are defining something and we're humans. And so as a student's behavior might start changing and our definition might start changing, we need to make sure that we are reoriented back to the definition. So every rating scale you use should have that definition, and you should be reminding yourself of that, or whoever's observing, every single time you go to rate it, because we want to make sure that we're rating it in the same way every time. Progress monitoring is important because it's regular, but it also needs to be done in the same manner. So this step cannot be overlooked, and it's very critical. All right, so that is step 2. And now we're moving on to creating a progress monitoring plan. Okay, so we've defined our target, we've defined that target behavior. What do we want to improve? What's our intervention targeting? We've selected a tool, we've aligned that tool so that it matches and mirrors the definition. And now we are ready to think about how we want this to play out. How are we going to collect the data? This step is so critical to make sure that you have a plan and you know exactly who's going to be responsible for what. So we want to determine the frequency of data collection. And this can be determined sometimes if you have a programmed or a tool, it will tell you how often they recommend it. But oftentimes this can be dictated by how often a student receives an intervention, how frequently the student is engaging in the behavior, and the capacity of the teacher to collect the data. Identify who is the data collector. Sometimes it's obvious, oh, the interventionist or oh, the teacher, but you want to make sure that that person is fully aware of that and they understand their role. The setting for data collection. Again, it might be very clear that the student has this issue in this one class period or this one time, but there are some students who engage in behavior across a large amount of the day. And so really thinking, are we going to start by collecting data across all of those time periods, or are we going to prioritize one time period at a time and then think about generalizing it? And then you want to create a plan for data storage and graphing. Again, we want to be respectful about this is data we're collecting, so confidentiality, making sure all the data has a home. And progress monitoring is contingent on us reviewing graphed data. And so often kind of a bottleneck I see when I work with schools is that we are collecting data, but it doesn't quite cross over to the getting graphed regularly. And so the data aren't used. And so really thinking about who's going to keep the data, who's responsible for graphing it. So here's just an example. This is nothing fancy. This can be handwritten in a computer, but this just establishes a plan so that the grade level team, the person responsible knows this is what's happening. So Mr. Kim is going to collect the data. He's going to do it in math class, and he feels he has the capacity twice per week, and that's enough time to see change. He's going to hand do his DBRs, and he's going to keep them in a folder. And then at the end of each week, he's going to graph them. Okay. Here, a recommendation again with this graphing, depending on if this works for direct observation or it works for the DBR. If you can create any electronic versions where you input the data or a spreadsheet where you put a number at the end of each day and it automatically graphs it for you, that will really save you from having to create a new graph every time. So that's just something I recommend, is kind of keeping this as simple and easy as possible. And if you can set up a system that you just have to put in one number or one percentage or one count and the graph auto-populates each day, is very helpful. So we've got our plan. Now we need to think about, okay, where is the student now and where do we want the student to go? So step 4 involves setting goals and creating decision rules for students. So what this step involves is establishing baseline performance, analyzing those baseline data to set a goal, and then creating a decision rule to know, is the intervention working? What are those progress monitoring data telling us? Okay. So let's start by talking about baseline performance. We want to know, before we jump in, before we start any sort of support or intervention, we need to know where the student is currently performing now. Okay. What is the student's behavior what does the student's behavior look like now? And what's key here is that we want to be able to compare, using our behavior progress monitoring tool, where the student is. And then once we start the intervention, how is the student's behavior changing when we measure it with the same tool? Okay. So often, we jump right into providing that intervention, but we really need these baseline data before that happens with our progress monitoring tool to have that comparison to know, hey, we implemented this intervention and we saw really improved behavior, or we're seeing the same behavior we saw as baseline. We need to make a change. So the baseline data are going to establish kind of that current level of performance using this progress monitoring tool. Now, unless there's an ethical reason to begin immediate intervention, so I'm looking at you all who students might be engaging in behavior that is harmful to themselves, like elopement, self-injurious behavior. Sometimes, it's not ethical. We don't have the luxury of waiting for 5 data points to collect the baseline. We know what's happening and we need to start intervening. So I want you to know that that is expected, 100% the ethical thing to do. But for some other behaviors that don't pose an immediate safety or aren't a danger risk to the student or others, we're asking you to collect some baseline data points. Now, we give a number and people think this is what you have to do. We are giving this as a recommendation, knowing that it's going to be a little bit flexible for people. So we recommend 5 data points. And the reason we're saying 5 is because there needs to be a sufficient amount to kind of establish a pattern of behavior. So we want that behavior in baseline to be stable, to know what level the student's at. And it's hard to do with 1, and 10 is too many. The student's never going to start intervention. So really thinking, how can we collect those data to establish baseline performance we're confident in? But there are some caveats. Again, we need to start intervention immediately if a student might be engaging in dangerous behavior. And so we would just start an intervention, start monitoring progress. We also know that for some students, they might have highly variable data. So some days are better than others. And that's okay. That's just the nature of how some students engage in behaviors. But we want to try our best to collect enough baseline data that shows some stability so that we may kind of understand where the student is. And then we're going to begin our intervention after we've established that baseline performance. So here's just some examples of baseline data that were collected. To orient you to both of the graphs, they're both collecting information on the percentage of time on task. So for each day, it's showing the percentage of time a student is on task from that DBR rating. So let's look at example 1 on the left. Okay. Here you can see we've collected 5 data points. When we're talking about stability, you want to think, if you were to draw a trend line, take the average. Is that line going to be pretty flat, pretty stable? Or is it going to be tilted up or tilted down? Okay. Anything with a huge slant in one direction, up or down, is not quite necessarily stable, or it might be all over, the data points might be jumping. So for example 1, those data we're considering stable. We're going to set the goal, begin the intervention, and we're going to continue to collect those progress monitoring data. Example 2, we've also got 5 data points, but the data here are pretty variable. We've got some ups and downs, and then we see kind of a decelerating trend. So here I would ask, if I were to see this graph, I would say, let's collect a couple more days to see if that stabilizes a bit. Or I also, again, I wish there was black and white rules here. Sometimes the behavior is just going to be variable. And at a certain point, you're going to have to say, that's enough baseline data. Let's get the intervention, and hope that the intervention improves behavior, but also shows more stability over time. So we've collected baseline data, enough to establish a pattern. And then we're going to set a goal. So here's where, again, I wish I could give you the goal. And when we're often talking about academic progress monitoring, this is where we're thinking, oh, let's look at the norms and the trend lines and where students are expected to be in this grade level. And that makes it really clear cut of, here's the baseline, here's where we're starting, here's where we expect students to go based on this nationally normed set of information. We don't have that luxury when we're thinking about behavior progress monitoring. But that's why I think this process can be really fun and really useful and really customized to the student. So here we're going to use the baseline data to essentially set a goal for that student. So to do that, kind of some rules of thumb, we want to aim for a goal that's higher than the average performance across baseline. Okay? And you want to keep in mind how you would expect a typical student to perform. So if you don't expect a typical student to be on task 100% of the time, it's unreasonable to expect a student that we're progress monitoring to meet that goal. So where do we think students are? And then to make sure we're keeping that into account to make sure that it's not too high of a jump for the student. We want to know where the student is average. The goal here is that we want the goals to be ambitious, but feasible to obtain. Okay. And it's never a problem. Sometimes, we want to shoot too high because that's where we want the student to be, but we can gradually increase our goals over time. It does not have to be, you set a goal once and that's it. I recommend that you start somewhere that seems feasible, get that student feeling some success, and then you can slowly increase that goal to where you want it to be long-term. So don't be afraid of setting a goal that feels like, well, what is the use of setting a goal at 50% on task? If that's an improvement for the student and that's going to allow them to access more instruction, you set that goal. And when that student is seeing success, then we revisit and we set another goal. Again, ambitious, but feasible. And this is going to look different for each student on kind of what ambitious looks like or what feasible is. It's also going to be dependent on that behavior. So all of these things to keep into account. So we've got baseline data, we've analyzed it, we've set a goal, and now you want to create a decision rule. And a decision rule is key because it is going to keep you grounded into knowing, okay, we have the data. When we collect more progress monitoring data, how are we going to know that a student, besides just we met the goal, how are we going to know that the intervention and the supports we're putting into place are effective and the student is responding to them? Okay. Meeting a goal one day does not mean, okay, great, our work here is done. We want to know, how confident are we that a student is learning these new skills and able to put them into practice in the classroom setting, that we can start thinking about those decisions. Okay, so we want to make sure there are clear decision rules. And a sample rule is something like this. Jacob is considered responsive to the intervention if his DBR rating for respectful language and math class averages 90% for 15 days in a 1-month period. Okay. Sometimes people also write out rules for what non-response looks like, but it just depends on kind of your level with decision rules and if you want to do that. But kind of setting how often do we want the student to have met the goal over a time period, and maybe if there needs to be kind of days in a row or data collection periods in a row. So let's go back to Eduardo. Okay. So we're starting by establishing baseline performance. Using a DBR, we've collected that prior to starting the intervention. So Mr. Kim and the team met. They're like, oh, he's got some needs based on my anecdotal observations. He's got some needs based on screening data. We're going to put him in intervention. But first, we're going to collect baseline data. So that's what they've done first. They've collected 5 data points. Okay. Here, we're going to consider them stable. We do have one data point high in the middle, but the rest of them are kind of hovering around the same area. So we're going to consider this stable. And so we're going to proceed with goal setting and start the intervention after the goal setting. Okay. So here on the left, the average percentage of time on task for baseline is 54%. So across all baseline sessions, Eduardo was on task 54% of the time. Okay. And we're going to make a goal at 70. And this is how the team came to this decision. Again, because it's individualized. The team determined it's ambitious, but attainable because it is above average. It's kind of closer to where they expect a student at his age to be on task. And they know that it is attainable because one time during baseline, he achieved 70% on task. And so they're confident this is a really great place to start. And again, I put that note. If you're thinking, is that the goal where we want the students to be 70% on task, that's still 30% off task? This is not the end all be all. We can, once we meet that goal, he's responsive, we can set another goal to make sure that we get the student to where they need to be to succeed.
So Caitlin, before you continue on, there was a question in the chat about how this relates to IEP goals and how you think about this within that concept.
Yes. So I'm just going to go back here kind of to this area. What a great question, Sandy. Thank you. So this absolutely maps onto the IEP process. And so kind of depending on where you are in this, ideally you'd be collecting this baseline data and you could use these data to inform that present level of performance narrative that you're writing, to be able to describe how often a student is engaging in a target behavior. And then when you're creating your decision rules or your goals, this is when you would be writing them for that IEP, kind of writing those main goals and then the objectives based on these data. Okay. And this is when I keep saying, we can start somewhere and we can increase that on an IEP, kind of your yearly goal could be to get the student to, let's say, 85% on task, but your objectives could taper that. So we start at 70% for, X days in a row, and then we could increase to 80% for X weeks in a row. And you could use those kind of to build up to that annual goal. But absolutely, these data can be used to inform that information in the narrative and then to develop those IEP goals themselves. And two, I think it's so helpful at an IEP meeting, like if you have these data and it's useful to the team, this really paints a very clear picture of here's where the student is, Here's where the goal, where we want the student to be, and really makes it objective kind of in terms of the thinking and the planning and showing. And then when it gets time to reporting on where the student is, again, IEP, or if we're a student in an intervention, it can be very clear, here's the goal. Is the student meeting that goal or not? Okay, so that brings us to step 5. Okay, so we've done all the planning, we've collected a little bit of data to establish baseline, we've set that goal, we've set that decision rule, and now we're off to the races. And we've just spent 45 minutes. You came here for progress monitoring, 45 minutes. We were talking about everything. And now we get to the, okay, now we collect the progress monitoring data. But that really does show you the amount of steps and planning it takes to do this process. And so I don't want you to undervalue thinking it through, selecting the tool, identifying the target behavior, establishing that baseline performance are really key to making sure that finally in this last step, those data we collect are going to be meaningful and important, and they're going to show if a student is or is not responsive to an intervention. So here, you continue to collect progress monitoring in the same manner used to establish baseline performance. And this really connects back to me getting on my soapbox about that definition of behavior needs to be on every DBR, every data collection form you have, because we don't want all of a sudden we're changing our data collection when the intervention begins, because that won't be a true comparison to baseline. So really important we're measuring in the same way. And really important we're graphing data on a regular basis, okay? This makes sure that data don't get misplaced, okay? And that teachers can easily access it to make decisions. We're not just collecting these data to have them, we want to use them to make decisions. Key decisions about students who are receiving interventions and to know if they need to continue or receive a different level, and key decisions about students who have an IEP and if they're meeting those annual goals or their objectives, we need that information. So it's really important that we're staying on top of the graphic. And once we have that graph data, we are going to analyze it and thinking about these 2 key questions. Is the student's performance improving? Okay. And is it improving enough to meet their goal? And so when we're analyzing data, again, behavior is a bit more individualized, subjective. We're not comparing it to these growth norms for these national standards that we do in reading and math. Okay? We are thinking about an individual student's behavior versus their baseline behavior. So here we think about level or the average, the trend average. The trend, do we see an increase, a decrease, level trend, or variability? Are the data stable or are they highly variable? And so all of these are in mind. And again, this is dependent on the behavior, but we often like to see stability or an increase in those target behaviors and a reduction in variability during the intervention. Okay, so we're going to look at these data. We're going to wait a moment to fully analyze them because that's in the next section. But then this next step with the case study would be to hear the data. We started the intervention. I put a line in my graph to note that that's baseline. This is intervention. There's the goal line. We have our goal for Eduardo, right? And we use this graph is clear to make decisions for Eduardo's instruction. This is the end all be all. This is why we're doing this. We're circling back to the beginning of why progress monitoring is important, this formal process. Right? So we've got the data, and now what? We're going to review it. Oftentimes this happens with a team. Again, an IEP team, a grade level team, a data team, tier 2 team, MTSS team. And you're determining if the goal is met. Okay, we have those decision rules. How do we know? If a goal is exceeded, okay, we might be planning for, again, if we're stepping the goals up, additional goals, fading the intervention, maintenance of skills. Okay. If the goal, so this is if the goal is exceeded, like we're blowing it out of the park. If we're meeting it, maybe we continue with the intervention, continue progress monitoring data, and then we make a plan for fading the intervention and maintenance of skills. And if the goal is not met, we're thinking about continuing the intervention. Okay, and then we're going to reevaluate and think, circling back to the DBI process, do we need to make any changes to the intervention? Is it just that the student needs more time or that the student needs something different? Okay, And again, I want us to think about this through the lens of our goal is to not have students be receiving interventions forever if they don't need them. We want to put something into place. And if that builds the students' skills where they no longer need that, great. We want to fade that intervention. We want to maintain those skills. And if an intervention is not working, we also don't want to keep going. We want to figure out ways that we could change it and supplement it. Okay. So some resources here. This is about teaming that can help kind of with that review stage of the data to make decisions. Team procedures are so important when you're looking at a lot of students' data and having to make decisions. So here are some resources that we've developed to help that teaming process, the review of data, go more smoothly. Okay, so now let's look at this case study. We're going to make a decision about Eduardo. His goal said his decision rule was if he meets the goal 5 data points in a row, we consider that as being responsive. So here we see that Eduardo has met or exceeded his goal a number of times. I believe it's 6 times, but it has not been 5 in a row. So what decision do we make? Okay, we are going to continue to collect the progress monitoring data. And if in our next time we evaluate these data at a team meeting, we have not met the goal, that's when we're going to figure out, do we need to make a change to the actual intervention itself? Because this does not seem to be working. Okay. All right. So we are I'm just going to briefly show you some resources to learn more, and then I can open it up if anybody has additional questions about what we've shared today. So our website, Intensive Intervention, has a lot of really great resources thinking about supporting students with intensive intervention needs, the DBI process, including progress monitoring. So check out that website. Some additional resources is if you want to learn a little bit more about DBR and the different ways that you could create or use DBR that's not maybe a 0 to 100%, there is an overview video about the DBR. Again, our progress monitoring tools chart, if you are new to behavior progress monitoring, you want to learn about different tools out there. Our tools chart, again, we have tools that are submitted by vendors or researchers, and our team provides ratings on the technical adequacy. So this is not a list of recommendations, or we are not endorsing any tools. It's just giving you information, kind of like a consumer report that you can use to make decisions about tools that you use. Again, I linked the teaming tools that we have here for facilitating meetings, reviewing data. These really help structure that process to do so in a meaningful way. And then we also have a series of professional learning resources about DBI more generally. We're also building out our online learning modules, and there are more on behavioral progress monitoring coming soon that will really break down each of those steps and provide more examples and opportunities to interact and learn about behavior progress monitoring. All right, so I'm going to pause here in our last 5 minutes. Thank you all for being an engaging audience, but I want to open it up to see what questions or comments you have after hearing us talk through this process for behavior progress monitoring. Okay, does not seem there are any questions. If you have them, please feel free to add. And before we go, we're going to do one more thing together. I would like you in the chat to put one piece of information that stuck with you today, something that you learned that was new, something that you maybe already knew, but you really want to think about, or something you're going to prioritize with the behavior progress monitoring. So what's something that sort of stuck with you from this presentation? Go ahead and put that in the chat for me before we wrap up. Right? Yep. Thinking about that teaming approach and using that target behavior. Awesome. Yes, that alignment aspect of not just picking the tool, but making sure it's aligned to the behavior. Yes, right. That distinction, monitoring progress and progress monitoring, often used interchangeably, but very different procedures, both very important. Awesome. Yeah, and if everything was new, great. I'm glad that you learned some of this information. like I said, we are posting this as a resource, and we please check back at our website. We're creating those learning modules that if you want to learn more, become more of an expert in behavior progress monitoring, they will be there. And yes, the importance of having teams. We should not, you can do this solo, but it's much better to have a team. Think about those data. And the more people who become comfortable with this process, the easier those processes will become. Yep, having a complete plan, reduction in variability of behavior absolutely is important. And then, yep, rethinking about that intervention. Oh yeah, it's realistic and data-based about what progress should look like. We know we want to get there, but again, we really need to be pragmatic in our approach to all of the things. Baseline data, absolutely, so important, Dana, I completely agree.
The one thing I wanted to plug was Caitlin also helped us revise some great modules that are training modules that you all can use, but focus on like the basics of behavior and understanding function of behavior. So for those of you that are in the role of training other people, those have suggested speaker notes, they have activities that you guys can use. So those are on those professional learning training section of the NCII website, and those are great resources that really, again, break down this basics of behavior that might be helpful for you if you're communicating this content with others. You know, sometimes that's the challenge that you are all faced with, is being the messenger out to other folks. So great resources there that you could draw on as well.
Great, thanks, Amy. And we're going to leave it with Chad's comment about trusting the process. Absolutely. If you're prepared, you have all the information, really trusting the process to help kind of guide the instructional supports for students. So great. Well, I want to thank you again all for your engagement and participation in this session. Here's some more information about where you can find our websites. And that's it. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day with the other sessions.